Natalie and I have known each other for a while. We met a couple of years before our show in 2015, and we've worked on a number of different projects together, and mainly the Grimm's project, but I've lectured or spoken with Natalie about her Story of O project. I have also actually modeled in one of Natalie's series of paintings. So we thought it would be fun to have a conversation kind of back and forth about what is going on in each other's lives, past, present, and future. So I think I'm going to start with asking Natalie talking with Natalie about her past and upcoming projects, and then hopefully we will switch gears and talk a bit about what's going on at the Drawing Center. So the place to start, we are going to start with Natalie's show at the Drawing Center in 2015, drawings of Grimm's fairy tales that Sam mentioned. And I think this is a useful place or an instructive place to start, I would say, not just because it represents the beginning of Natalie and my relationship, but also because it represents a turning point of sorts for Natalie that I think has really continued, or what started with that group of work has continued and developed even to the present day. And so this was actually this show, I believe, was the first time you had made a concerted body of drawing. I mean,
is mine on?
Yeah. I don't think so, but.
Okay.
Oh,
yes.
It is?
Okay. Yes, it was the first time I'd made a body of drawings outside of a traditional drawing from life class.
Right.
And yes.
Okay, and I think that's also instructive for this conversation because I think one of the reasons why I felt that the Drawing Center was a great place to show this work, or that Natalie made a lot of sense for the Drawing Center, was not simply because these are, as you will see, incredible drawings. Natalie's an incredibly skillful artist, but fierce, and in terms of the subject matter and her skill as a draftsperson. But also because one of the things that we like to do at the Drawing Center is really give people an opportunity to explore something new in a way. Often, instead of just doing shows, of someone who's been making amazing, we do that as well, certainly, of someone who's been making drawings for their entire career. One of the things that we like to do is offer them a place to explore something new and really think through, well, what drawing is to them. And when I first met with Natalie, she was just starting this series of work. Mm-hmm. I can't remember how many you had made when we did our first visit, but the series grew far beyond that first visit, and I think it was sort of through that conversation and really through your knowledge that you were going to be showing these in that context, that you kind of had that, I don't know what the word is, courage, strength, impulse to go so far with them as you did.
Definitely an impulse.
Yeah. So I think maybe we'll start. Do you want to just talk us through the series a little bit, and the series as a whole, and then maybe walk us through some of the individual drawings, and what was the inspiration also for beginning this series? Why suddenly did you decide, okay, I want to make this body of drawing, and why the Grimm's fairy tales?
Yeah, and thank you for having us. I'm really honored to be here. I took classes here when I moved to New York, and it's really exciting to be here. And if you have questions or anything, just raise your hand or scream, and we'll stop. The Grimm's came about, I was in my mentor, Paula Rigo's studio, and she said, have you looked at the Grimm's? And I said, no. And she said, well, you should do them because I'm in my 80s and I'm not going to get around to them, and someone needs to illustrate them or draw them in mass. And so the first book I ordered off of Amazon was Jack Zipes' Translations, and fell in love with the stories. And I have pretty strong synesthesia, and so it was the first time that I read something and cohesive pictures and colors came to mind. And so I started drawing them kind of secretly because I'm a painter and I don't draw. And I was having painting shows and had a painting practice, but I started drawing these in the summer in a barn in Canada, and continued to make them kind of privately. And I think Claire was probably the second person to see them. And it was an interesting process because I had studied from life and from the model since I was maybe 12 or 13, pretty seriously. I didn't think that I had the imagination or skill set to draw if I couldn't see something in front of me. And the idea of making a drawing with a narrative seemed impossible to me. And something about these fairy tales and something about this combination of gouache and chalk pastel unlocked sort of a magic in the process of drawing. And it became like a compulsion to draw them. And so I ended up making 75 large-scale drawings. And then when we began to talk about the show, the Drawing Center often does a catalog, a small catalog, and I said, I really want these books to take a life in the form of a book.
Right.
And that seemed appropriate since that's where they had come from.
Right.
And so began to put together an art book of the stories and marginalia, and it grew from there.
Right, right. I mean, there's a really wonderful, maybe now would be the time, I would love to read this. I brought in a passage of something that Natalie had written about drawing, about discovering drawing, and sort of exactly what you just said. So I think now might be a time to read that, about how the drawing sort of unleashed the imagination for you. But I think it's really interesting, you'll see when I read this, that it's almost that the form of the drawing, or the material of drawing, somehow in its visual form echoes the subject matter of the fairy tales. You'll see what I mean as she talks you through the fairy tales, but maybe I'll just read this first if I can. It's so dark in here and I don't have my reading glasses, so I can't read this. Maybe I should have you read this. Can you read this better than me? Or I wonder if we could have a little more light. Yes.
Should I get my cell phone now?
Yes, get the cell phone. I need yeah, I can't read it. It's terrible. This is a relatively new affliction of being unable to read without bright light. Okay, this is great, perfect. Okay, so this is referencing a body of work that Natalie made that we're actually not going to discuss today, just in this first sentence. A year or two before I began to make pulp paintings, I also began my first body of drawings in gouache and chalk pastel. I had never thought enough of my abilities as a drawer or my imagination to think I could really, in italics, draw. I assumed my strengths were as a painter. I never cared much for drawing that felt too representational. I wanted to explore the areas of transformation possible in drawing, the ways in which gouache and chalk pastel can vibrate and trick the eye into believing that the picture is moving. Color and form here could easily go in and out of human and animal, material and illusion. There was something easy and free and also directly from the imagination that felt part of the image. I began drawing unsanitized fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm, then on to a few more bodies of work looking at fairy tales and one erotic novel. Drawing took me into an imaginary world, one that correlated with the centuries-old magical stories, and to Story of O, a physically charged 20th century novel that I looked at. So I really just think this is lovely because it's showing, it's not just some incidental thing that you started to draw and you happened to draw the fairy tales. It's almost that drawing was the only medium in which you could approach this subject matter, and also that this subject matter could only be approached through drawing for you, not through painting. Right. And one of the things that you'll see, and maybe this is the point where you can walk them through a few of the images, one of the themes that you start to see or tendencies that you see in these Grimm's drawings is this idea of metamorphosis that Natalie, that was mentioned in this passage a little bit. This shifting, and this is obviously something from the stories themselves, as we know, if we've read fairy tales, shifting from human to animal, the way in which one thing becomes another thing, but that Natalie really explores in her drawings, and that you are also discussing as being the terrain of drawing itself as a material. So I think that's really interesting. I don't know if you want to talk about that generally or just take us through the drawings.
I think what drew me to the stories themselves was their origin as women's oral tales, and the idea that these transformations that you mentioned represented a type of power shift and freedom for women in the middle class. Though these were upper class women who were telling the stories, they were passed down from woman to woman through the generations in domestic spaces. And they were a way for women to talk about their fears and anxieties and desires. And once I read that, Marina Warner wrote a great book about From the Beast to the Blonde, about the representation of women in these stories as authors, but also in imagery. They became so much more personal. And I think I began to equate that act of drawing with something that felt intensely personal, and could see myself in these various tales because women were allowed to transgress and commit crimes and eat their children and dress up and go out into the woods, and it was exciting. And I think in the previous work I had been doing, it was about possibilities for women as a feminist gesture of what can we do, where can we locate our source of power.
And I think this idea, I just want to go back to one image. Is this how do I go back?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's not moving.
No.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Just, I really think this represents that idea of metamorphosis, both visually, but here you can really see the use of pastel in this kind of, in the passage, the literal passage.
The sliding.
From the little sliding of is it a donkey's, what a bear?
A lion.
A lion, okay, the lion's face, and this is all, the story all fur into the woman's face, but that idea, I think that's a really interesting idea too. That this notion of kind of unfixity, right? That's something of the possibility of becoming one of moving between identities as being a feminist act in itself.
And you don't have to commit to being a princess or evil. You can kind of slip around a little bit. Right. And it's maybe not a luxury that's always been afforded to women in literature or history or daily life or art. And there's power in that, in disguise.
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to show us a few of your other favorite ones?
So this is the Brementown Musicians. This was one of the few kind of happy Grimm stories about a band of animals that come together and actually take the place of humans. This is the Juniper Tree. This is one of the stories that later I drew from, worked on a ballet, which I'll show you some images of, which is an incredibly gruesome story about a stepmother who takes a young boy into the family and decapitates him and then cooks him and feeds him to the father for dinner.
But I think one thing that's important to understand, just so people can understand how there is this feminist side of it, is that a lot of these stories were written as kind of warnings in a certain sense, or sort of ways of dealing with realities that sadly in some form or another did actually occur, and warnings for women often, even though the women undergo kind of these sort of terrible fates. In some ways, they are a kind of a form of empowerment in saying, these are things that might happen, and how will you deal with these things? They're not sort of a denigration of women in the way that sometimes they have been seen to be, or the case can be made.
Right. Well, it's a powerful thing to see yourself reflected in art, and that hadn't been done.
Right. Right, and that as well. Yeah.
Sleeping Beauty. This is the Ungrateful Son. Rapunzel. Non-traditional heroine, Rapunzel.
Right.
Frog King, which in the original, she has sex with the frog by throwing him against the wall, and then, of course, marries him.
Right.
Oh, it's repeating. This is the cover of the book. So when we started to talk about the exhibition, I said, I've always wanted to do this book, and found a publisher who gave me a lot of freedom to put it together as I wished, which was a great experience to go out and figure out how to produce a book and hire a book team and go on press and work with colors on press. And yes, so this is the format of the book. Every chapter had its own title page and then border. And it was really exciting for me because Linda Nochlin wrote an essay for the book on Little Red Cap, and then I did a conversation with Julie Taymor, and then Claire kindly wrote an essay for the book.
Yes. Yeah, so I think we're moving into the sort of next body of work. Natalie even previewed an image, but also just the idea of the book as being, in a way, another art form. So that's something, another sort of, I guess, question that I want to ask, or just something that I want to pose or think about, is I think this turn to drawing is, I think, accompanied by a more general turn towards a number of different things, but one being narrative, which is not to say that painting can't be narrative, but I think that there is, and certainly your painting, well, that's actually something maybe I could ask you, whether you think about your paintings as narrative in the same way or not. But I think there's one element of narrative which is present in your drawing, present in the book, present in this ballet, which Natalie will talk about, which is this idea of temporality, which is not present in painting in the same way, in the sense that I think you have always made drawings in series for the most part. Since you've been working in drawings, they've always been bodies of work or series, and not just the fact that you were making many, many Grimm's drawings, but you also, it was very important to you to make more than, I mean, there were a few cases where you had only single drawings for a story, but for the most part, there were multiple drawings per story. The fact that in some cases there were 2, some cases 3, some cases 5 was in itself significant, because it's this idea that stories can be told, in different ways at different lengths. And how do you choose to illustrate a story when you have 5 images versus when you only have 2, And then the book obviously was the kind of full fleshing out of this idea of narrative. And then the ballet is a totally other form of kind of temporal experience. So I have a bunch of questions packed into this, which we can sort of take at different moments. But one would be just what was it like then to move into the ballet? What was it like to experience working in that form? And how has working in this form, or these kind of narrative forms, impacted your work in painting? Because you do still paint. And how do you approach those media? So maybe we can talk through the ballet and then kind of go back to that.
Yeah,
but that's a question I would like to ask.
Yeah, I think it was originally, these are some of the costumes. This is from the Juniper Tree, the golden bird. And it was completely disorienting and exciting.
So set the stage first. Did you
come into this?
What the ballet was?
Oh, yes, thank you. So the ballet is called Grimm Tales, and it's 3 tales based on the book and drawings I had done. And we picked Frog King to begin, Juniper Tree, and Snow White was in the center. And we took some liberties. So in Snow White, there was no prince. She ran off with the dwarves. We kind of picked the characters that we had more of an affinity with.
Right.
But the head of Ballet Austin came to me, and he had seen the show at the Blanton and asked if this was something that I might be interested in. And I think before he even got it out of his mouth, I was hysterical, and said yes, of course. So he really was wonderful in giving me free rein to put together a team again, but not my world at all. So I got to find a costume designer and a set designer and an animator, and there was someone who built these headpieces. I painted all the headpieces. The costume designer and I painted all of the costumes and fabric, and then a specialist textile painter painted from the drawings. And then the animator, I worked with the animator to bring some of the drawings to life, and I have, I think, one of the animations here. And then the choreographer really did his thing. And that was a wonderful part of this project, because I'm used to as an artist, type A micromanager, controlling every aspect of my work. And in this, I didn't even see the choreography until 5 days before opening night. None of us did.
Right.
I didn't hear the music, which was a new commissioned score. So it was a very kind of interesting process where you trusted all of the artists that you were working with, and we had regular meetings and we knew what we were all doing, but there was some delegation, which was a great experience to have. But I worked on this about 2 years, and it was just incredible to see the drawings come to life. And we decided that the sets should be the drawings rear projected. They were double projected from these ultra strong projectors. And so the way that we made them move was to animate the drawings. So I'll show some of, this is from the Frog King. Okay, so this I included, this was the drawing. So the drawings were 20 by 30 inches. On screen, they became 20 by 30 feet.
And these were drawings you made for this show, not previous
So
drawings.
some were drawings, about 20 were drawings from the book, and about 30 were new drawings I made just for the production. And so this is what it looked like on stage. It's a very dark photograph.
That's incredible.
And then this is how it was animated. Let's see. This was another Sleeping Beauty Briar Rose image. The dwarves. I love the dwarf costumes. They were like Weimar coal miners with specialty headlamps on their heads. Frog King. This was one of the masks I painted with a really amazing artisan who built these, the armatures. This is the golden bird from Juniper Tree. The red hot shoes from Snow White. And again, this is the drawing I made. This was the final scene for the ballet, and this was from Juniper Tree. And then this is how it was animated. Is it gonna move? Yeah. And it was really exciting to see it 30 feet long on stage.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And then I thought, should I run through some of the other?
Yeah, why don't you run through some of the other projects, and then we can sort of go back to that question.
Okay.
Just so that everyone can see, where you've continued to go with this interest. Because I think you have brought this kind of work and not your painting practice.
Yes.
So,
yeah. So basically, after doing the Grimms, I started before the ballet. Fell in love with bookmaking. Fell in love with working from these narratives. And Jack Zipes, the scholar I worked with on the Grimms, said, let's do the Sorcerer's Apprentice next. And this was a fascinating group of stories, which had originally pivoted all around women, but after Christianity, all of the women were excised from the tales and men replaced them because the idea of women shape-shifting became too threatening. So this traced the tale type of the Sorcerer's Apprentice through about 2,000 years of literature. And so the cover and back cover were color, the flaps were color, and the drawings were black and white. And I, of course, tended to focus on the women in the stories, except for that.
And was that just out of necessity that they were black and white, or was there?
Yes.
Yeah.
As I learned, making books is very expensive. Making color books is prohibitively expensive. And so this was the first time Princeton University Press published this book. And they're the publisher I'm working with on the new book, which will be full color. So this was a beginning. And then I turned to the story of O, the erotic Snm novel, the first novel written by a woman about women in S&M, written in 1954, banned upon publication. The author kept her name anonymous for 40 years, and no one believed that it could have been written by a woman because women did not possess erotic imaginations. So to me, this seemed like a really good break from fairy tales, and but a very contemporary fairy tale. And so a woman goes into a dungeon and explores her proclivities and sensibilities, both with men and women, but ultimately with herself and what her desires are, what her limits are. And it was an interesting experience to do this work. It was just as Me Too was starting. I had just written an essay for Art News about my 10 years of sexual harassment in the art world. This felt like a very intimate body of work to put out into the world.
Yeah, and in fact, it was, not to mention any names, but it was originally slated to be exhibited at a gallery, and then that gallery decided it was too, and it was a woman, right, who ran it. Decided it was too difficult subject matter. It was too charged, I guess, that, that it was too upsetting or too charged, so she canceled the show. So it's sort of its own form of...
And in this instance, a book served an interesting purpose.
But then it did get shown at a different gallery.
It did get shown by a man at a different gallery, at Half Gallery. And I had always intended to make a book for this exhibition. So I put together a book with Lucia Marquand, and it was 15 drawings. It was very important for me to provide context for this story. So there was an interview with Lawrence Weschler from The New Yorker, and kind of a little bit about the history of the book, why it's important, and so that in this instance, the book served, I'd say, a different function. It also, we pulled out quotes because it's under copyright to explain some of the scenes. So, for instance, a lot of people think of Story of O, and it's, a woman goes to a dungeon and has lots of sex and is whipped. But there are actually many relationships, power relationships that she has with, in this instance, an older woman who runs a finishing house for women. And this is one of my favorite drawings from the series.
Yeah, but it's interesting also that this book is not, you can find this book quite readily now. I mean, as you said, it was written in 1954, is that what you said? But that's something about the visualization of this book, or maybe just this different world of the art world right now, that there was a need, that it seemed too charged to show the images, even though this book itself is completely out there now. So that's another interesting idea about the power of the image, I guess.
Which seems both comforting and inspiring that art can, that someone actually thought art could traumatize someone, as opposed to a book or a president or what have you.
Yes.
This is how it was installed.
See what's coming up here.
I designed wallpaper that the drawing sat on, that was a line called Fem Power that was released with flavor paper. And then to transition.
There, I said that I had modeled in a series of drawings, so here I am, So
this is the current book I just finished, and these are the tales of Baroness Catherine Delnoy from 1692 to 1698, who invented the word fairy tale. And this will be 8 of her tales. They're literary fairy tales, so they're much longer than the oral tales of the Grimms. And they are archly feminist. They have a lot of magical transformation, female to animal transformation, jewels. They're very Baroque. They show women being artists and writers. And she was remarkable in that she was one of the first women to take authorship of her work. So she signed the front piece of all of her editions. And she's a little before Perrault, but because she's a woman, she's really not well known, despite having invented the word fairy tale.
So maybe now is the time to address that question, or unless is there anything else here that you wanted to, just that question about painting and that how you feel about painting. Now, I mean, it's just a really interesting thing that you were a painter for so many years without drawing. Now you have this whole body of work that you make, but you do still paint. How is the experience different? And when you choose to make a painting, what kind of subject would you say, okay, I'm going to do this in a painting versus, And you still haven't made you're still thinking about drawing very much in series.
Yes, drawing is based on literature for
Yes,
me, and
yes.
so it comes in series.
Right, right.
But I don't think of these as drawings, or not paintings, or paintings or not drawings.
You don't, right.
They're just, for me, drawing and painting can collapse the distinction, because they are gouache, and even though they are on paper, they're a wet medium. And I think I've come back to painting with this understanding. I think from working on the ballet, a sense of clarity is necessary. So the paintings have really simplified and emptied out. I think the pointedness of narrative is also a tool to clarify, which has come into the paintings. And I think this general idea of exploration, which drawing made me feel safe doing, has come into painting. So I'm working on paintings on metal and using acrylic and ink and just in painting in ways that feel looser and less guarded, which I think has generally been good for my work.
Right. I think I hear that from a lot of artists, that there is this way in which when they start drawing, I'm thinking of Eddie Martinez specifically, who I also did a show with, but he was talking about this recently, that he, that looseness of drawing as something that he then tries to get into his painting, and he feels like by having done drawing, he is a better painter in a certain sense, because
absolutely.
he can be freer in painting than he was able to be before he spent so much time drawing, or maybe, I guess he's sort of always drawn too, but when he sort of consciously started thinking about trying to bring that fluidity of drawing into his painting. So anyway, it's interesting. Relationship.
So I want to hear what you're doing, and tell us about some projects you're working on and have worked on. And
sure. So I think, and we probably have till 7:30 about, right? So I'll just do this really quickly, because then we want to leave you all time for questions. So I will just, I'll sort of talk you through our current project that's up at the Drawing Center. And I think this is a very big shift of gears in a way, but I think it's really, it's sort of instructive to see kind of the show I did with Natalie and then the show that we're doing now, in a certain sense, because both are sort of thinking through the power of drawing and what drawing can be and what drawing can do. I think in Natalie's case, it was a sort of liberating experience for you, working in drawing, and the freedom and the looseness and all of that, which is in a certain sense parallel to our current show, which is called The Pencil is a Key, Drawings by Incarcerated Artists. I don't know if anyone has had the opportunity to see that exhibition at the Drawing Center yet, but I hope that you will all come, because it really is a very, I think it's a great show, if I do say so myself, that was worked on by an entire curatorial team. It was really an absolutely co-effort with 5 different people, which I've never actually done at the Drawing Center before. It is a show that looks at essentially sort of what it says, drawings by artists who were incarcerated, starting at the time of the French Revolution and going to the present. There are some sort of leaps in time, but it does really trace that course. And I think one of the things that was very important to us, and really the idea behind the show, is thinking about drawing as a way of envisioning freedom, or drawing as a way of maintaining a sense of for these artists, of maintaining a sense of humanity under inhumane conditions, or in situations of confinement and loss of freedom. And we came to this premise thinking, well, not having many ideas of who the artists would be in this show, and I think our initial list was dramatically different from where we ended up, not even knowing if we would find what we thought we would find, but in fact we found just a tremendous amount of human spirit, I guess, in doing this show. So one of the things that was very important to us from the beginning, and I'm just showing you an installation view of the show. I only have installation views here, not views really of individual artists, although I have some closer up views. But was that it be a show of artists, That was very important. Not just work that happened to be made by someone in prison in a prison art program. There is a lot of that work out there, and we do show some of that in the vitrines in the back room. But I think a lot of the work in that sort of tends to fall into kind of certain types of genres, you know, a lot of religion, sex, certain kinds of themes that come up again and again. But we were really looking for individual voices, right? And people who were who, you know, maybe they were artists before they went into prison, maybe they became artists while they were in prison, but who really thought of themselves as, who identified as artists and were using that medium as a way of, you know, expressing something unique to them, I guess you could say, rather than it just falling into a certain kind of genre. So, you know, it was a really kind of, I think how, you know, this sort of suits the drawing centers, obviously an entirely different kind of thing from Natalie's show. There are some well-known artists in the show. You know, we do have a Courbet, and we have some, you know, some kind of master type names. We also have, you know, people that are sort of well-known in the contemporary world, like Purvis Young, who is a self-taught artist, but who has attained stature in the contemporary art world. But then we have people who, you know, may not be known, you know, within the art world at all in a way that we are sort of bringing into view. But I think so. It was a really, but I think what makes it so appropriate to the Drawing Center is that really thinking about kind of what drawing is, what drawing can be, and you know how drawing is in a sense a unique form of art making. You know, why is it drawing that people are doing in prison rather than other forms? There's a lot of answers to that question, but I think at the Drawing Center we're really trying to think about, well, how does that medium, what can that medium say that other media perhaps don't say, which I think is or aren't saying in the same way, which I think is, you know, what we were sort of trying to get at in the discussion about Natalie's work. So I'm happy to, you know, I don't know if I should talk through specific work here or you know, specific examples of things in the show, or you had some questions, I think.
Yeah, I'm curious, when you set out to put together a program for the Drawing Center, there's so many different ways to use drawing, whether it's personal or as an activist or as something that represents a very current sort of time that we're in. How do you approach putting together such disparate shows and then also programming in general, say over a season?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I have to do things pretty intuitively, because if I try to sort of say, oh, okay, what's out there, I have to represent that, or I have to represent this, I think that just doesn't go anywhere good. You know what I mean? So I have to start from something speaks to me, and then I think about its relevance. Do you know what I mean? And I think to myself, okay, you know, and there's many different types of shows we put together, obviously. There are shows of young artists who I just encountered their work, like with you or with Curtis, you know, where I didn't know their work beforehand, and really my getting to know their work is coming about sort of almost simultaneously with the idea of putting together a show. Then there are cases where it's an older artist that I've known for a long time, obviously, and then they sort of suddenly come into view in my mind as being someone that I'd like to do a show with. But I think the first thing is something about the work is speaking to me personally, and you know, it's sitting with me, and it's not going away. You know, sometimes you'll kind of have the visit and then it'll go away, and then you think, okay, I really like the work, but it's not urgent. It's not necessary for me to do that show. But in the cases where they stick with you, but then I think to myself, does the world need to see this, or is this just my own personal, I just love this? You know what I mean? Because I do think, so you start from what is meaningful to you, and then you go to, you know, is this relevant to put out there? Because I do think that you do have a responsibility as a curator, not simply to put on shows of work that you love personally. You know, it's also a responsibility to, does this speak to the moment? So I think that's where those two things come together. Kind of what is the tenor of the time? what is out there and what hasn't been out there, and what do you think needs to be out there? Now, do I know whether it needs to be out there? Obviously not. But so that's my own, sense. But I think it's thinking of those things together. And then I think when we do, then there is some kinds of logistical balancing that obviously happens between like these kind of conceptually driven group shows versus a kind of more retrospective show of an artist who's either sort of towards the end of their career or deceased, versus a show of a younger artist with a contained body of work, like the show I did with you, or the show that I am doing with Curtis. Sorry, I keep pointing to Curtis, who's in the front row here, but I'm doing a show with him in the winter, which is really a kind of commissioned type of show, which is something that I've done a lot. That's another type of show we do at the Drawing Center, where it's not saying, okay, we're going to show this Grimm series of drawings, but we're saying, okay, you have this gallery. And gallery space, which we have our main gallery space, our drawing room gallery, which is a sort of smaller, more intimate space where Natalie had her show, which is one of my favorite gallery, actually, or our downstairs gallery, and you kind of think about, you produce something, for. So we do try and balance those different types of shows out. And I think we hadn't done, one type of show is this more sort of historically expansive show that looks at that is speaking to the way in which drawing is a vital form, in our world. And I think that was what sort of the Pencil is a Key is addressing. And then the next two shows that we will have this season, or the next three shows, I guess, are all kind of single artist shows. One of a younger artist, a commissioned project. One of a artist who actually two now of deceased artists. The woman that I'm doing a show of, Huguette Caland, in the spring, just recently passed away, and one who's even older, Chinese artist, self-taught artist. So trying to kind of, balance those different sorts of projects out.
And maybe a last question, at a time when media seems to have distinctions can collapse, how do you think about or define drawing for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I guess my first inclination is sort of definitely not to adopt a strict definition of drawing. One thing I will say is we certainly do not define drawing at the Drawing Center as works on paper, which is the way that certain institutions define drawing. That is not the way we define drawing. For me, I think drawing has to do with this idea of temporality that I mentioned, in relationship to your work, and really, which does connect to this idea of the line, in the sense that the line the line moves from one place to another place. And there is that sense of transformation and movement, and the kind of lack of finish, I guess, that goes along with drawing too, which doesn't necessarily have to mean that the page is blank, but there is this sense in drawing, because it is quicker, it is more fluid, and it does traditionally have that idea of a kind of sketch, right, built into it. That there is this kind of non-fixity, which is, which we were talking about in relationship to your work, that is maybe, that is specific to drawing more so than it is to painting. So for me, I think about it in relationship to that idea of passage and movement and non-fixity that I see as being the kind of arc of the line of moving from one place to another place, even if it's not that you're literally tracing the line, I guess. Yeah.
And I think it's as someone who goes to drawing groups once in a while, I think artists are very, feel almost naked when they do drawings, and probably students here can tell you that that's the artist at their most vulnerable, that you can really see what they're made of when they draw.
Right.
Especially hands and feet, but
yes.
When they're really drawing, you know what you're dealing with.
Yes, and I think that's also what's nice about the space of the Drawing Center, because the Drawing Center is such an intimate space physically. We're not a huge space, and we have deliberately maintained that smaller scale, I think because it is an intimate space, and drawing is an intimate act. And I think one of the things that a lot of artists that I've worked with have said, and is sort of what you said also, is that it becomes very personal for them. And even when I did this show with Rashid Johnson, you know, I mean, which is actually funny because I wouldn't say that the work he produced for that show were drawings, but they were black wax on tile works. But they were called drawings after being at the drawing, just because they were at the drawing center, which is kind of funny, because I would not call them drawings. But I think it was the act of thinking about making work for the drawing center that for him, what he did do was start working in a much smaller scale with a different hand gesture and in a much more intimate form. And the work that emerged was this incredibly personal body of work, this series called The Anxious Men that he's continued to work with. In fact, he has an opening tonight at Hours and Worth, which we couldn't go to. But where you see the way these anxious men have developed, but that was the first time that he worked in a figurative way because he was working in a that kind of brought out this personal element in thinking about, well, what does it mean to work in drawing?
And I think artists need people like you to spur us to become a little more vulnerable in our work, and then it really goes on from there.
Oh, well,
So.
that is lovely to hear. Well, I think that takes us to 7:31. So maybe we will open up if anyone has any questions. Thank you.